So for the next 25 to 30 minutes or so, the topic of discussion is going to be running shoes, and more specifically how the new runner makes decisions and ultimately chooses the shoe that's most appropriate for them. So it's fair to say this is aimed at the person buying shoes perhaps for the first time, and not the experienced runner. However, hopefully there's enough information in here that everyone listening can take maybe one or two things away from this talk. The reason this particular subject was decided upon is ultimately that it's an incredibly hot topic, and certainly in my entire career I've never known it be so popular as it has been in the last 2 to 3 years, with the foot and the footwear itself garnering almost disproportionate amount of attention with respect to running. I think that what this serves to do is mean there's an incredible amount of information out in the public domain, whether it be from individuals or marketing companies or shoe companies, blogs, etc. And for people who perhaps don't have a great backing in this subject, that can just hugely increase their confusion. And this obviously fueled by the fact that a lot of the information out there will disagree with itself. So that's hopefully what we're going to try and give people an introduction to. The big disclaimer before we start is that it's a huge topic, and this is a very short period of time, so we're not aiming to be all-encompassing. This isn't going to be an exhaustive discussion of the topic, just a bit of an introduction into a couple of things that may be worth considering. What you may find by the end of the talk is that you have more questions than answers, and I think that's probably indicative of where we currently are with the science behind this, and of course we'll go into that a bit more later on. So here are going to be the main discussion points for this talk, and first up is the model which has been suggested that all runners pick their shoes on for about the last sort of 30 years or so. So we're just going to have a little chat about that, just for those who may not have come across it, and have a little look into the science behind it to see if we still feel it's appropriate in this day and age. Then we'll move on to the anatomy of a shoe, and what I mean by that is the sort of terminology that has been used for many years, sort of behind the scenes, but it's much more recently become popular in sort of in the marketing literature. I think it's really good to have an understanding of what some of these terms mean, because otherwise you can get a little bit bamboozled by them. And then in the context of those two things, we'll talk about the actual runner when they're standing in front of a wall of shoes in a store, or they're looking at pages and pages of shoes on their laptop. What considerations should they be making? What options are actually out there, and how do they sort of filter down those options into finding a shoe that's good for them? Now at some point thereafter we will touch on running technique very briefly, an entire topic in its own right, and again another controversial one, but I think you can't really talk about shoes nowadays without technique being mentioned, as there is thought to be a slight overlap. And ultimately then we'll try and make some conclusions if we can. So the take-home messages, the things that hopefully after listening to this you can add to your sort of knowledge base and take forward with respect to discussing these things with someone, or actually purchasing a pair of shoes. So this is how it's been suggested that you should historically choose your shoes. And I say historically, but we should probably also say currently, because you will still see this model discussed on various websites and in various magazines, and it's colloquially referred to as the wet foot test. Now we don't really know who invented it. We don't really know exactly when its conception was. There is some suggestion it has its basis in the sort of US military back in the 70s, but we don't know for sure. But it sort of insidiously grew within the community and then sort of became folklore. And for those that aren't familiar, the general gist is that following an observation of the footprint that a wet foot of yours leaves behind, you then subcategorize yourself into one of these three predetermined arch types. So the one on the far left there is often referred to as a flat foot or a pronated foot. or a low arch, and the one on the far right there, the high arch or the supinated foot. And at the time, the mainstay of running shoes available to the population were the three categories of road running shoes. Now, of course, we know nowadays we have far more options available to us, but this model really only takes into account the three categories of road running shoes, which are from right to left the neutral or cushioned shoe, the stability shoe, and then on the left hand side the motion control shoe. So for a long time it was thought that by observing this sort of static measure, this standing still footprint, and then putting yourself into one of the shoes as suggested, it would be the easiest way for you to find the best shoe for yourself and to minimize your risk of injury. So when we look at this model in light of the current evidence, we do run into some problems with it. First of all, it's been fairly well agreed across all of the research that's looked into this with respect to static measures not consistently predicting dynamic function. Now, what we mean by that is we can't know for sure how someone's foot is going to perform when they're actually running, just based on looking at a impression of what their foot does when they're standing still. And that's fairly important to understand, given that the wet foot test model essentially is entirely based on a static measure, and this will not tell us what, as we say, what someone does when they're running. So that's the first issue. The second is that categorization of all feet in the entire population into just one of three groups, one of three arch types, is hugely simplistic. Now, of course, we want things to be as simple as possible, but no simpler. And although it leaves a very, very tidy sort of pigeonholing approach to identifying your foot type and finding a shoe, which is very, very good from a decision-making perspective and also from a marketing perspective, it just is simplified to a point that is inappropriate. And furthermore, I think referring to someone as a pronator or as a supinator is also very poor terminology, given that almost every single runner that we see will be both of those things. They will pronate and they will supinate. These are the movements that the human foot makes. So I think categorizing someone as one or the other is very inappropriate also. When studies that have been performed have looked at this model, the wet foot test, and then investigated its role with respect to reducing injury, and these were studies again done in the US on military populations, they've shown that choosing a shoe based on that model does not reduce your injury any more than just picking a shoe at random. So given that the model, one of the things the model hopefully is aiming to do is to reduce injury risk, unfortunately the model has not been shown to do this. So where this leaves us is ultimately that we need to approach things in a different way. We must be more sort of specific to the individual with respect to choosing shoes. It makes choosing shoes far more complex, of course, and it's nowhere near as tidy, as I say, as the wet foot test model. But if the wet foot test doesn't sort of hold itself up to scientific scrutiny, then I think it's fairly fair to say that we need to move on from it, and hopefully it won't be too many more years before we stop seeing it. I think the real unfortunate fact here is that it's just so neat and tidy, and it's therefore persisting. So as I'm sure many people are aware, we have lots more shoes available to us nowadays other than just the road running shoes. And the ones that people are most aware of, I believe, are what are referred to as the barefoot shoes. Now, barefoot shoes is a term I think is utterly ridiculous, but I'm going to use it just because it's the term that most people are familiar with. And I think the one good thing that's come out of this entire debate is that now the runner has far more choices available to them. And given that we're going to be harping on about how individual this decision-making process is, then the more choices there are, the better. But just another word of warning, really, with respect to the way certain shoes are marketed. And it's absolutely clear to us that the way it's been suggested road running shoes should be picked, i.e. the wet foot test, is completely inappropriate. But just to make absolutely clear, that does not mean that those shoes are inappropriate. Now, there will be certain individuals that those categories of shoes will be absolutely necessary to ensure they can run to the best of their ability with respect to injury minimisation and performance maximisation. And just because the model is wrong, it doesn't mean the shoes are wrong. It just means we need to find better ways of identifying which individuals those shoes are best for. And I think any company or any individual that suggests that because that model is wrong, it means all those shoes are wrong, and therefore by proxy the other, there's another group of shoes that are right. I think that's to be just treated a bit skeptically. I think the take-home message from this particular point is just be wary of anyone that hugely polarises this debate. It really shouldn't be an either or situation. It should be the case that there are different shoes out there, there are different people out there, and what we've got to do is get much better in identifying what shoe is best for what person. I think on that note, this quote sums things up beautifully for me with respect to knowing where we are currently and where the data and where the science is currently with respect to running shoes. And it's an incredibly uncomfortable thing to have to admit, but it's just not where we think it should be, or not where we would want it to be. Now, rather than ignore that, I think we have to be honest with ourselves and honest with the public and sort of say that it's a work in progress. But furthermore, again, treat with caution anyone who just feels a bit overconfident they've got all the answers to this topic, because anyone that you speak to of any significant standing within the scientific community will be very clear to you in regard to this not being the case. Okay, so with respect to some of the terminology that is often used about shoes, I thought it would be sensible to put up a sort of a collection of shoes, the kind of shoes that are available currently, so that we can show how they differ in some of their characteristics. So top left here is called the Hoka. I don't know if anyone is familiar with it, but it's probably one of the biggest, bulkiest shoes on the entire market. Certainly anecdotally noticing a huge increase in interest in the ultramarathon and endurance runners with respect to this one. Next to that, on the right hand side, is an Asics 21 series, which for a time was their most popular shoe in the stability range. Bottom left is the Nike Free, which when it first came onto the market was actually marketed as a barefoot shoe. And then bottom right is the Vivo Barefoot, which is amongst one of the many sort of barefoot or minimalist shoes on the market today. So the first characteristic I've highlighted here is the dual density midsole in the Asics 21 series at the top right. And as you can see, it's essentially the midsole made of the same material, but there is a section which is a different density. So the grey area that I've highlighted is stiffer or firmer than the white portion of the midsole. Now what this means is it won't compress as much for a given load. Historically, this has been referred to as pronation control or rotation control. We tend to try and think of it nowadays as the stiffness of the midsole, and try and match the stiffness of the midsole to what we think is appropriate for the runner. But I think the point being here that this talk is mainly aimed at decisions runners can make for themselves, and this isn't one that is particularly easy to decide upon. We know that the wet foot test, which historically told us whether this was appropriate or not, is probably not to be relied on, and therefore you're really going to only be considering this sort of technology or having this sort of discussion if someone else recommends it to you, and that will usually be a specialist either in a store or your health professional, your physiotherapist or podiatrist. It's a huge topic in its own right. We know that this particular feature is certainly not appropriate for all of the people all of the time, but as we said before, we don't polarize these sorts of debates, so we also know that it's not going to be inappropriate for all of the people all of the time, and we just have to get as good as we can at identifying who we think this would be beneficial to. So the first real term that I want people to become familiar with and understand the meaning of is what we refer to as the stack height. Now the stack height is identified in these slides with the red arrow. This is the stack height at the rear foot of these shoes. And as you can see, the Hoka has the highest stack height by virtue of it being one of the biggest, bulkiest shoes. The Vivo Barefoot has the lowest. Its stack height won't be 0, depending on the model. It will be perhaps 2 millimeters or so, but it will be the closest thing to 0 available. And these stack heights will vary. So I think the idea that I want people to visualize is that when they're looking at a shoe, there are going to be differences between these shoes. And ultimately, the higher the stack height, the more cushioning the shoe will have. So in exactly the same way that you have a stack height at the rear of the shoe, you also have one at the front of the shoe, which I've just highlighted in this slide with the purple arrows. Now in most shoes, by virtue of the way they are manufactured, the stack height at the front and the back of the shoe will be different. And what this will mean is that if you subtract the front of the shoe, the stack height at the front, from that of the back, you'll be left with a number which shows you the difference in the height of the two. Now we've always referred to this as the pitch, but more recently it's become very common to refer to it as the drop. So we'll use the word drop for continuity. Now, as you can see in these pictures, the drop here is different in these shoes. The Vivo Barefoot at the bottom right is what is often referred to as one of the 0 drop shoes, and by that we mean the stack height at the front of the shoe and the back of the shoe is the same. And the first point of note, just because a shoe is big and bulky doesn't mean it will have a huge drop. As you can see from the Hoka here, top left, it actually has a lower drop than the Asics stability shoe. Secondly, with respect to this number, we are not shooting for a magic number. So it isn't the case, despite what you may read, that one number will apply to all. And I make no apologies for repeating myself with respect to the fact that we are all individuals. So this number will be very different person to person. Now when someone is picking a shoe for themselves, they'll tend to gravitate towards the thing they intuitively find most comfortable. And we'll talk a bit more about comfort in a moment. Taking a step aside from people making their own decisions and talking about professionals making decisions and perhaps encouraging people towards or away from certain drops, they'll often take into consideration many different factors. To name some, the person's current injury, perhaps any previous injury they have, their current sort of strength conditioning, and also actually their goals and what they're trying to achieve. And the real sort of take-home message on this one again is that these numbers vary. We need an appreciation that different shoes out there will be different to each other, and we need to then try and identify which numbers work best for which people. Now, some people may want to introduce variation into their training and have different pairs of shoes with different drops. These numbers are very, very available in most shoe marketing literature. Other people, perhaps new runners, may want to just stick to one thing for the time being to minimize any significant changes. So it really is, again, as I keep saying, a very individual thing. So the final bit of terminology we're going to refer to, and it sort of comes with a slight cautionary tale also, is what we refer to as the ramp angle. Now the ramp angle isn't always as readily available as things such as the stack height or the drop. If you're particularly handy with trigonometry, you can actually work it out yourself, but actually far easier. There are many good online calculators for this sort of thing also. Now the ramp angle is essentially, when we look at the diagrams here of these two triangles, the ramp angle is the steepness of the top side or the slope of the triangle. And what you can see is it's completely and utterly dictated by the relationship between A and B, A here being the height of the triangle and B being the length. So when we bring this into an example of a running shoe, if A is the drop of the shoe and B is the length or the size of the shoe, then what you can see is that shoes of the same drop but different lengths will have significantly different ramp angles. And I think this really hits home that these numbers aren't not to sort of hang your hat on them too much. To give this some sort of an everyday illustration, let's imagine I took an entire running club of 100 runners of all different shapes and sizes, and I told them all that we now believe that a 5mm drop is the best drop for everyone. It will make them run faster, it will reduce their injury. If every single person in that running club buys a shoe of an identical make, identical model, and an identical drop, by virtue of them all having different size feet, they will actually be buying shoes which have different ramp angles. Now, what this means essentially is that as far as the mechanical changes that shoe may influence on the foot, it will be different for every single person. Now, I'm not saying that these are good changes or bad changes, but they're changes. And any mechanical change will change the way the tissues function, will change the internal stresses within the tissues whilst running, and this will have the ability to influence injury risk. Now, of course, it may decrease risk, but it also may increase risk. So I think this really illustrates the point that these numbers are not to be applied to all. Just because you've got the same shoe, the same make, the same model, the same drop as your wife, it doesn't mean that you have the same mechanical outcome. So before we talk about some of the considerations to make, let's just try and reflect on some of the things that we've discussed so far. And I think it's quite clear that in the absence of any science definitively pointing us towards the most appropriate shoe all of the time, it's very, very easy to appreciate just how confusing this process can be for the runner buying their first pair of shoes. Now, one sort of thought process that I subscribe to is that instead of thinking of shoes as different categories and thinking of this either or type scenario, to instead visualize shoes all on one spectrum or one scale, with shoes like the Hoka down one end of the spectrum and the barefoot shoes down the other end of the spectrum. Now, all shoes available on the market can be somewhere between these two extremes based on the characteristics that we've discussed. And I think that's why I want to get across just how important these differences are with respect to stack heights and drops, etc. Because depending on these characteristics will depend on where this shoe is within this spectrum. And I think the best way to try and narrow down the most appropriate shoe or shoes for an individual is to try and find out where on the spectrum they will fit the best. Now, we have always known, or intuitively at least, that a shoe that's comfortable is something that would be sensible to have in place. But a very, very well-respected biomechanist based out of Canada has been collecting data over the years, and he has suggested that increased comfort will actually be linked with a reduction in injury frequency. So perhaps we have, although known comfort to be important, perhaps we've underestimated just how important. Now, although sort of telling a new runner to just go and buy a shoe that's comfortable sounds a bit sort of like a throwaway comment, the interesting thing is that there is just as much science, if not more, behind this than there is with respect to things like the wet foot test, despite them being much more nicely packaged. So if we go down this comfort route just for one moment, we know that comfort is very, very subjective, so what one person finds comfortable will be different to what another finds comfortable. And another reason I really wanted to get across an understanding of these different terms is that I think they will significantly influence how comfortable an individual finds a shoe. So when we talk about stack height, we essentially are talking about how cushioned the shoe is. Now, we know that some people want a very, very cushioned ride. That is what they will find most comfortable. Others, it's exactly the opposite of what they want, and they want to feel as close to the ground as possible. They want to feel every single foot strike. That is going to be very, very person specific. And remember, there isn't any significant data to suggest that one is better than the other. When we talk about the drop, as we've already referred to, again, people will find different drops comfortable. Some people will find a zero drop shoe incredibly uncomfortable, depending on their tissue lengths and things. Others will find a high drop very, very cumbersome. A very, very individual thing. So an understanding of the stack height and the drop and how they will influence the way the shoe feels on a given individual is something I think that's very important. And ultimately, it's a bit of trial and error. It's a bit about trying on different shoes to try and identify which one feels best. And I think the final point with regards to comfort, which we haven't talked on yet but is also very important, is the width of the shoe. Now I remember when I was younger, whenever we bought a pair of shoes, my dad took me to the store. I got in this big exciting machine, and it sort of measured the width of my foot. And at some point, that just kind of fell away, and then it was a case of buying a shoe that was a size 7, a size 8, a size 9. We now know that width has a significant influence on comfort, and we've got to try and match the shoe to the person. Now, the reason we know this is so important is that we are, again, all built differently, and our feet will be different widths. So you do not want to put your foot into a shoe that is too narrow for it. At the same time, you may not want to put your foot into a shoe where your shoe feels like it's got the ability to float around in it. So you've got to try and pick a shoe which has the appropriate width. Now, when it comes to different brands, they will all come up slightly differently. So in exactly the same way that a gentleman buying a shirt for work may find himself leaning towards one particular company because the cut of their shirts just seem to suit the shape of his body the best. When it comes to sort of buying your shoes, rather than having any sort of brand loyalty, you're much better off trying on different shoes from different companies to see which one essentially fits your foot the best. We know that they all come up differently, and we know that some of them are generally thought to be more narrow than others. Now, the main reason for this is that shoes are made on what we call a last, and we know that the last in the Asics factory is going to be different to the last in the Brooks factory, is going to be different to the last in the Hoka factory, etc., etc. So when we're picking a shoe based on comfort, as that has been suggested, take into account the make of the shoe. Does that particular brand fit the width of your foot? That's probably the first thing to identify. What are the brands of shoe that I should avoid, or I should sort of move toward? Once we know the make of the shoe, let's think about its stack height. How much cushioning does it have? How much cushioning do you want? Thereafter, the pitch or the drop of the shoe. And again, that will be something very, very individual and specific. And I think once you know the rough sort of characteristics with respect to all of these factors that suit you the best, then you are in a reasonably good position to say that you are in the best shoe for you at that time. Now, of course, it may well be a very dynamic principle, and as you change, and as your running changes, and as your tissues change, you may find that you want to change things up, or you may find that what you once found comfortable, you don't find comfortable anymore. But this talk is mainly aimed at people picking the shoes for the first time, and what the current evidence suggests is if we use these concepts, then we are in a reasonable position to say that it's the most appropriate way to proceed. So, as promised, just a couple of very brief slides on running technique. A huge and wildly popular discussion in its own right, and a slight overlap with footwear. And I think the main reason this has happened is that you will read that a given shoe will encourage a given technique. And I think whilst certain shoes will inevitably facilitate certain techniques, the point I want people to be absolutely clear on is that you can run with any technique you desire in any shoe you wear. That is absolutely to be the case. In exactly the same way that buying a new golf club doesn't make you Tiger Woods, buying a particular shoe does not fix your technique. Now, I don't want to underplay the importance of technique. I, for one, feel it incredibly important. But you know, if you want to be Tiger Woods, you spend a lot of time working on your swing, and you get that absolutely perfected. And then ultimately, you'll probably find that whatever club someone gives you, you can hit incredibly well. And I think we've got to think of running technique in a very similar way. If you work on your technique with someone who is a specialist in that area, not only is the best way to get good technique to work on your technique, but you will actually find that the range of shoes that you can then wear will actually probably slightly widen. So rather than buy a shoe to get a better technique, I think people are thinking about it completely the wrong way around. Technique's important, but to sort your technique, you sort your technique. Now, when you change your running technique, you will change the way your tissues are loaded. That's absolutely clear. And It's a zero-sum game. So what this means is you may remove stress from one area of the body, but you will be increasing stress at another part of the body. And I think that's something to acknowledge. Now, this may be exactly what is trying to be achieved when changing someone's technique. It may be exactly what you're looking for. But I think when people, the danger we are concerned about is when people read marketing literature or read a blog or read an opinion and suddenly decide, well, I'm going to do that because it said it's better. They suddenly make a change and they get problems. All changes should be gradual. All transitions should ideally be monitored. And what the question you really need to ask yourself if you're considering a change in technique is why? Why am I trying to change my technique? What is the goal here? And that's something you may want to discuss with someone. But just to bring this back onto the topic of shoes, shoes are just a part of the puzzle. And in exactly the same way that we've talked about shoes being very person specific, the ideal or the optimal technique will also be very, very person specific. Now, going back to the analogy of the golf swing, you look at all of the elite players on tour at the top level, or you look at the amateur guys at their local club, you will see that everyone's swing is different, visually different and functionally different. However, what we believe is that most good golfers will have certain fundamentals in place that are very, very similar, their grip, their stance, etc. So with running technique, there is no one ideal or optimal technique. It will be person specific. But actually, by the same token, we do believe that there will be underlying fundamentals that we see similarities in people that have very good technique. So just to illustrate some of the things I've just been talking about, I want to show this great slide which was put online a few years ago and made available by Ian Hunter, who's a professor of biomechanics at BYU in the United States. And it shows the left and right foot strikes caught by the fastest 20 male and female US athletes during their trials for the 10K Olympic team just prior to London 2012. Galen Rupp, leading man there, obviously Mo Farah's training partner, and silver to his eventual gold. So the first thing to notice is that these times are absolutely insane, and I don't know anyone that wouldn't take one of these times tomorrow if they were offered to them as a personal best. When we look at these people at the absolute top end of their game, what's quite clear is that they're all hitting the ground differently. So with respect to their foot strike, you can see huge variation in their foot strikes. The argument put forward is that if there was one way to run, if there was one way to hit the ground with your foot, if there was one way that made you fastest and that reduced injury risk, it's a fair assumption that these people who do this for a living would probably all adopt that way. Now, the other way of looking at it is perhaps they have adopted that one best way, but as we keep saying, that one best way for them, which isn't the same as that one best way for their running partners. Going back to what we just recently mentioned about the fundamentals being in place, clearly this is only one facet of running technique, i.e. how the foot hits the ground. We cannot see where their foot's hitting the ground relative to their body, but we can probably assume that all of them, if we looked at their global technique, would have very, very similar characteristics, and the good things that we think need to be done well, I'm sure would all be doing well. But again, just really to illustrate to the new runner who reads things about forefoot striking being good or heel striking being bad or whatever it may be, firstly, just remember this slide. Just remember that people at the top end of their game don't all strike in the same way. So there's no suggestion whatsoever that we all need to strike in the same way. And secondly, again, just to bring back to that point we spoke of several slides back, if you ever see anyone polarizing the debate, just have a little warning light flash up, because we just do not know enough about this topic yet for any of us to be completely and utterly confident with respect to what is most appropriate. So to conclude, and hopefully I've done a reasonable enough job of articulating this and these take-home messages, just sort of cementing the thought processes that we've sort of built on throughout this talk. First up, we really do want to see the back of the wet foot test. We just don't believe it stands up to scientific scrutiny, and we do not believe it has any sort of weight in this current and ongoing debate with respect to choosing shoes. Secondly, we hopefully have made clear that certain shoes and of course techniques will benefit certain individuals. So it's about picking the right horse for the right course. Now, as an individual, choosing your first shoe, this can be quite challenging. There will undoubtedly be a sort of trial and error sort of element to it. I'm very fortunate that generally when I see people, I get time to spend with them one-on-one and talk very much in depth regarding their history and where they and their goals. Obviously, usually they're injured, which makes things different, but I think it's never been more complex picking a shoe, but just be aware that different shoes will work for different people. So again, be aware of people really pushing one particular shoe on a big group of individuals. Bullet point number 3 is that comfort is king. We've talked about comfort a lot in the sort of last quarter of the talk there, and whilst it does sound a bit flippant to sort of say pick any shoe that's comfortable and you'll be okay, and certainly anecdotally I don't think that's completely accurate, we can say for sure that if you're in a shoe that's uncomfortable, then that's inappropriate. Fourthly, and we haven't really touched on it, but it sounds obvious, but it's worth mentioning, it's absolutely true that you have the ability to get injured in any shoe you wear. You also have the ability to get injured with any technique you run. Now, given your own characteristics, you may be manipulating that injury risk to your advantage by being running in a certain way or wearing a certain shoe. But again, the injury risk will always be there. It's about controlling it. It will never be zero. And just treat anyone with a healthy dose of skepticism if they're suggesting to you that they can completely reduce your injury risk by doing A, B, C. And the final point, and a very old adage, is if it's not broken, why don't try and fix it? And the question here, of course, is, if things are going well with respect to the way you're running, in the shoe you're wearing, with the technique you're running, why would you try and change it? Now the answer is, of course, when things are sometimes going well, we want them to go better. We want to be faster. We want to run further, etc. But any changes you make, whether it be footwear changes or technique changes, just be aware they have the ability to manipulate that injury risk. They have the ability to bring that risk down, but likewise they have the potential to bring that risk up. So before undertaking any changes, if you've been lucky enough to find the shoe that works for you, and you decide you want to move away from that, it may be something you want to take some advice on. So many thanks for your time. Hope that was at least of interest. As I said at the very start, may well leave people with more questions than answers, and that's just hugely suggestive of where we are with respect to our current understanding of this topic. I certainly don't have all the answers. If we're clear on this, it's probably fair to say that no one currently has all the answers, but it is a work in progress. There are many differing opinions, and I think that's what makes it such an exciting topic to be involved in at this time. As with all of these sort of talks, it isn't now that is the end of the discussion. Quite often I find it's the very beginning of the discussion, and I'm happy to answer questions or have discussions with people with respect to anything we've talked about, anything they may disagree with, which is of course very much encouraged. Discussing this topic is never time wasted. So my details, my email, my Twitter and Facebook details are all there, and please do get in touch if you have anything you want to chat about. And many thanks again for your time.